With Hashem's help, we're going to learn today Yevamos Daf Nun Zayin. We left off yesterday Yevamos Daf Nun Vav Amud Beis by the Mishnah. A few words of introduction. As we mentioned in yesterday's shir, when a Kohen does Eirusin, does Kedushin with a Bas Yisrael, the fact that they are engaged mid-Oraisa gives the Kala the right, the permission to eat Truma. Midrabanan, the Chachamim were afraid of two things, as we spoke out yesterday, the Gemara Masechta Ksubas. Number one, being that she's still the base of Viha, she's still in her father's home, if she would be allowed to eat Truma. If she would eat Truma, she would take Truma there. She might accidentally share that Truma with her father, with her brother, and then you would have a Zar that's eating Truma. And the other chashash, the other fear the Chachamim had, was that on rare occasions when a man does Nesuyin, it's called Simpoin, which means he'll find a big blemish in his wife, and he sometimes will be allowed to claim Mekach Tos, that this is a mistaken marriage, and retroactively nullify the Kedushin, and then Lemafreya, it's going to come out that she ate, not as a engaged woman to a Kohen, that she was a Bas Yisrael to the Eitrum. Let me add something to that. We have what we call a Mishnah Rishayna and a Mishnah Achrayna. According to the first Mishnah, even though what I'm going to say now was ultimately changed, but there was a certain time during the times of the Tanoim that they held that the Medvarim Amurim, that the Chachamim made a takana that a woman who's engaged should not be allowed to eat Truma. That is if the date of marriage did not pass yet. What was common then was for people to wait 1 year between the Eirusin, between the engagement and the marriage. But once a year passed, and if this individual chassan had a reason why he delayed the marriage, but this is an unusual case, over there, since she should have been married after the Zman HaNesuyin, the original Zman HaNesuyin, she now will be allowed to eat Truma. And this will be the way Tosfos and many of the Rishonim will be learning the case of the Mishnah and the beginning of the Gemara. Rashi, as we'll explain in a moment, we'll learn the case of the Mishnah a little bit different. But let's begin inside the Mishnah. If you have a Almana that got engaged to a Kohen Gadol, right, this is an Nesuyin, which goes against a Lav. Obviously, the Tana of our Mishnah is not Rabbi Akiva. The Tana of our Mishnah holds that both the Eirusin and the Nesuyin could be Chal, but it's a sinful marriage. It's also important to note that when Hashem says that a Kohen Gadol should not marry a Almana, or a Kohen Hedyet should not marry a Gerusha, the Mishnah adds the words Chalutza here, because Chalutza midrabanan is like a Gerusha, but as we will learn, God willing, in tomorrow's share, when it comes to the din of this Mishnah, Chalutza really does not belong here. So when you have an engagement between an Almana to a Kohen Gadol, or a Gerusha to a Kohen Hedyet, Mishnah says, Min ha'erusin, if they are only engaged, lo yechlu betruma, they should not eat Truma. So as we just gave it the words of introduction, we're speaking about a case where the Zman HaNesuyin passed. And normally, one who's engaged to a Kohen, even midrabanan, if the marriage date passed and he for whatever reason did not yet marry her, in such a case, normally she will be allowed to eat Truma. Here, she will not be allowed to eat Truma. Why not? She's engaged to a Kohen. She's engaged to a Kohen Gadol. So, as the Gemara is going to show, that this Tanakama is Rabbi Meir, who holds, these are the words in Hebrew, that when a woman is mishtameres lebia psula, when a woman is awaiting a forbidden act of cohabitation, she does not have the right to eat Truma, which is a chiddush. Note, what actually makes her unqualified? What act is the prohibited act? It's the act of bia itself. Here she's only engaged. The engagement is not in violation of a lav. Even the Nesuyin, if Nesuyin is not bia, if Nesuyin is only chuppah, the Nesuyin in itself is not in violation of the lav. The lav is the bia that they will have. Until the act of bia, this woman is not a halal yet. No lav was violated. Nevertheless, since they are going to get married, and they're the mishtameres lebia asura, Rav Meir holds she does not have the right to eat Truma. I mean, this is the way Tosfos learns the Mishnah. Rashi also has such an opinion, but Rashi brings down another scenario. That here we're speaking about a Bas Kohen, the opposite. Now understand something, that a Bas Kohen really midoiraisa only becomes a Chalola when she has a Bia with, let's speak about the Kohen Gadol, and she's an Almana. Right? The woman here is herself a Kohen, a Kehenes, which means that she is allowed to eat Truma in her own right. Same thing, says Rashi. Being that she, as an Almana, got engaged to a Kohen Gadol, or as a Bas Kohen Gerusha, got engaged to a Kohen Hedyet, Midoiraisa, when will she become a Chalola, this Bas Kohen, when she has Bia with her husband, which is a Bia Asura? However, Midrabanan, according to Rav Meir, since she's waiting for a Bia Asura from the moment of engagement, not after a year and they didn't get married. The moment you get engaged, you no longer have the right to eat Truma. It's a much simpler way of learning the Mishnah. That is the Tanakama, which is Rabbi Meir. However, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon both say Machshirin. In other words, both the way Tosfos learns, both the first way we explain the Mishnah, that we're speaking about a Bas Yisrael who is engaged to a Kohen or Kohen Gadol, she is an Almana or she is a Gerusha, and the year of engagement passed and they're not yet married. So back, the Chachamim allow her to eat Truma, even though she will become prohibited to eat Truma the moment she has Bia with her husband, but she didn't have it yet, she's only engaged. Or the way Rashi learns that we're speaking about a Bas Kohen, who is a Gerusha that got engaged to a Kohen Hedyet, or a Bas Kohen Almana that got engaged to a Kohen Gadol, yes, God forbid, if she will go through with the marriage and have Bia with her husband, then she'll become a Chalola, but she's not yet a Chalola, and therefore she's allowed to eat Truma. Continues the Mishnah, if nis'armalu or nis'garshu min hanisuyin, if such a woman were to get married, and then the married were to end, since she had Bia with her husband, she's pasul, she will no longer be allowed to eat Truma, correct? So either we're speaking about a Bas Yisrael who had a child with her husband. Normally when a Bas Yisrael has a child with her husband who's a Kohen, even after the husband dies, she normally retains the right to eat Truma. Here she does not, because it was a prohibited marriage. However, min ha'erusin, but if she gets separated from the erusin itself, even Rabbi Meir, who held in the Reish of the Mishnah, that a woman who's mishtameres l'biya asura cannot eat Truma, here she's no longer mishtameres l'biya asura. Here she's separated. So she's kosher, min ha'erusin ksheros. Ksheros will mean that she will be allowed to marry another Kohen, according to Tosfos. According to Rashi, she goes back to be allowed to eat Truma because she herself is a Bas Kohen. Okay, so that's the Mishnah.
What's the difference between Rashi and Tosfos?
Again, according to Tosfos, we're speaking about a Bas Yisrael, and the word Kesheris will mean that she will be allowed to marry another Kohen. She did not become a Chalala. She did not become a Zoina. And according to Rashi, that we're speaking about a Bas Kohen herself, Kesheris means she right away goes back to be allowed to eating Truma in her own right. Good, klar. Says the Gemara. Tanya, we learned in a Braisa, and it is from here that we see that the Tanakama of our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. That Rabbi Meir is justifying, is giving a reason for his opinion in the Reisha that she's engaged, she cannot eat Truma. Kal v'chaymer. Uma kedushei reshus ein machilin. If, let's speak about the case, let's speak about Tosfos, who says the Mishnah is speaking about a Bas Yisrael. If a Bas Yisrael gets engaged to a Ben Yisrael, in other words, there is a kosher engagement. Just because two people are engaged doesn't mean that they have the right to eat Truma. Ein machilin. So even by a kosher engagement, ein machilin, kedushei aveda lekalchen. Here she's engaged to a man who midoiraisa she's not allowed to get married to, so of course she should not be allowed to eat it. According to Tosfos, this kal v'chaymer is a little bit of a doichik. Like, what does one case have to do with the other? Here it works better according to Rashi, that if a Bas Yisrael, Kohenis, that gets engaged to a Yisrael, midrabanan, the Rabbanan who were machmir in the case that we mentioned in the introduction, the Rabbanan can be machmir, they can be mekel. In other words, midoraisa, by an engagement, the status of the man goes on his wife. which is why midoraisa kohen, very good, a kohen who gets engaged to a bas Yisrael, midoraisa she can eat. But in the reverse, a bas kohen who gets engaged to a Yisrael, since she's engaged to him, she can no longer eat truma. So when it comes to kedusha rishus ein machilin, so for sure here she got engaged to a man. He's taka a kohen, but so what? But she's a grusha. He's a kohen gadol, but she's an almana. So that engagement is a prohibited engagement. Is kedusha aveda lekolchkin that she should not be allowed to eat truma. You know, the Kal V'chomer by Rashi goes a little bit smoother, and Amrullah, to this responded both Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon that lohi im amarta b'kedusha rishus. Let's talk about both Rashi and Tosfos. We're beginning always here with Tosfos. If we're speaking about a Bas Yisrael who got engaged to another Yisrael, the reason why ein machilin, because since she got engaged to a Yisrael, no matter who he would get engaged to, any Yisrael who gets engaged to any woman, no one will be allowed to eat truma because they got engaged to him. So of course, if he gets engaged to a Bas Yisrael, she's not allowed to eat truma because she got engaged. The husband is never someone that can bequeath the right, so to say, of eating truma. He's a Yisrael. But when it comes to an engagement between this Bas Yisrael, who's a Gerusha, right? Let's say to a Kohen Hedyet, if he would have gotten engaged to another woman who's a non-Gerusha, then the fact that he is a Kohen engaged to a woman or later married to a woman, he does have the power to give her the right to eat truma. That's according to Tosfos. Let's go according to Rashi. We're speaking about a Bas Kohen, right, who got married to a Kohen Gadol. So the same thing. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon says, when the husband, the chassan, who's a Kohen Gadol or a Kohen Hedyet, had he gotten engaged to a woman who was not a divorced woman, who's not a widowed woman, even if she would have been a Bas Yisrael, then he would have had the power to give her the right to eat. So over here, the husband is a Kohen and she's a Bas Kohen. Of course she should have the right to eat. She can eat because she's a Bas Kohen. She can eat because she's engaged to a Kohen. She will become a Halala and a Harami. The moment there's going to be the act of cohabitation, there's going to be a bia, then she'll become a halala, then she will lose her right to eat. But until that happens, why should she not have the right to eat? She's a Bas Kohen engaged to a Kohen. Very good. Now, comes the Gemara, and the Gemara says the following. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Oishia. Rabbi Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Oishia, Petsua Daka Kohen, look at this case. A Kohen who's a Petsua Daka. The Pasuk says that Lo Yavai Petsua Daka Ukrus Shavcha, a person who has crushed or maimed testicles. We're going to learn more details about the exact meaning of this defect in the private parts later. But let's stick to the Hebrew words. A Petsua Daka is not allowed to marry into Lo Yavai Bikahal Hashem. Cannot marry into the congregation of God, which means that most Jewish people, as we'll see soon, today and later in the later sugyas, a Kohen, a Kahanes, a Leviah, a Yisraelis, according to certain people, Gadim, according to other people, Gadim maybe not, but their children, first generation, are all called Kahal Hashem. So Lo Yavei Ptsua Daka B'Kal Hashem. There's a big restriction upon whom he can marry. Now, if you have such a Kohen who got engaged to a Bas Yisrael, here, it's not because she's a Gerusha like in our Mishnah, because she's an Almana, which is why Hashem prohibited the union. He cannot marry her. Same thing, the Isur of Lo Yavai is Bia. He cannot have an act of cohabitation. Here he got engaged. So you would think that it's connected to our Mishnah. Says Rabbi Ishia that Banu Lamachlokas Ramei Rabbi Elazar. That this is the argument of our Mishnah. L'Rav Meir, who said in our Mishnah that a woman who's mishtameres libia psula da'iraisa, that a woman who's awaiting, so to say, to do a Torah prohibited act, a Kohen Hedyet with a Gerusha, lo yachla is not allowed to eat truma. Likewise, hanami lo yachla, the kala even though the isur of lo yavai bikal Hashem is to have an act of bia that not yet happened, but they're engaged, they're gonna be together. So she no longer can eat truma. But according to the Tanoim of our Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, that they hold that mishtameres labi psula deraisa, still the achla she's allowed to eat, turning to Daf Nun Zayin, ha nami achala, she too will be allowed to eat. Interesting, in other words, she's a Bas Yisrael. Here, according to everyone, we're speaking about a Bas Yisrael. She got engaged to a kain. Again, midai raisa, an engaged woman is allowed to eat. Here, everyone, both Rashi and Tosfos, have to explain our Gemara, the Mishnah Rishayna. Because if not for the Mishnah Rishayna, forget about him being a Psua Daka. Midrabanan, a Bas Yisrael that's engaged to a kain cannot eat Truma anymore. But we're speaking about a case where the Bas Yisrael who's engaged to a kain could eat. It's after the year of waiting, and for some reason he did not yet marry her. Now the Chachamim say that she could eat. Here she cannot eat, according to Rav Meir, because she's Mishtameres L'bi Psula. According to Rav Elazar and Rav Shimon, here she's allowed to eat. Just want to point out that the words that we speak about here, the Ptsua Daka, this is the famous Aleph versus Hey letter. Every letter in the Torah is perfect, and we have a Messiah. Nevertheless, we find by this one letter a disagreement if the word Daka is written with an Aleph or with a Hey. And we have the famous Hayom Yom. It's somewhere in the beginning of Chodesh Elul, because it's connected to Parshas Ki Tzeitzei, where the Rebbe writes from the Frierdiker Rebbe that we write Ptsua Daka with an Aleph, the way it's written here in our Gemara. And the Rebbe brings two proofs for that, aside of quoting all of the different Achreinim, Poskim that say that way, and you have people who paskin the opposite. But number one, the Frierdiker Rebbe writes that when he was in Worms, if I'm not mistaken, that they have over there the Sefer Torah that was written from the Maharam of Rothenburg, right? The famous story that he was kidnapped and he was sequestered by the Goyim, and he himself paskin that he's not allowed to be redeemed. You cannot redeem a Jewish captive, Yoser Mechdei Demehem, and he ended up even passing away there. And many years later, I think in Alexander, someone redeemed him. Then they're buried together today in the Beis HaChaim in Worms. But when he was in, so to say, when he was in jail, when he was incarcerated, a malach came to him. He was in pain that he couldn't learn Torah. And the materials to write a Sefer Torah, the parchment and the ink, they allowed for him to have in the cell. But, a Sefer Torah you have to write word by word from a written book. You have to look at a Sefer and write. You can't do it by heart. But a malach told him what to write. And in that Sefer Torah, there was an Aleph, Psodaka with an Aleph. And the Frierdiker Rebbe also writes, and here I think it's in Prague, if I'm not mistaken, that there's a Sefer Torah there that was checked over using a Sefer Torah that was checked over by Ezra. In other words, like this, the Sefer Torah in the second Beis HaMikdash that was written by Ezra, which Ezra was Magia, was based off the Sefer Torah that was written by Moshe Rabbeinu. Imagine. So that's already only one step away from Moshe Rabbeinu. And then there was another Sefer Torah that was based off the Sefer Torah of Ezra. So that's three Sefer Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu, Ezra, and that Sefer Torah. And over there, the Ptsua Daka was with an Aleph. But coming back over here, so it's puzzle, and if I'm not mistaken, he writes in Hayom Yom that they dance with that Sefer Torah on Simchas Torah. It's not kosher to read from, but we have it there. It's amazing. So now the Gemara says, Mimai. The Gemara challenges Rabbi Yishya, Dilma, perhaps, that At Kan Le Kamer Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon Hassam, like they explained in the Braisa, that even though, let's say, it's a Kohen Hedyot engaged to a Gerusha, the reason why she's still allowed to eat, or according to Tosfos, she's allowed to eat, she's a Bas Yisrael, why can't she eat? Ela the yesh lo ilahachal b'makam acher, like they explained in the Braisa. Because if not for her prohibition of her being a Grusha, the husband has the power to give the right to his Kala, to his Nesuya, to eat Truma. Abul Hachi, but over here, being that the problem comes from him, the Kohen is the Psua Daka, the Ein lo ilahachal b'makam acher. So maybe even Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon will agree with Rabbi Meir that Hoyelu Mishtameres L'Bia Psula, and no one who's married to him will be allowed to eat Truma. Anyone married to a Psua Daka, once they have the Bia Surah, becomes a Halala. So then maybe she should also not be allowed to eat right now. I know that I keep on mentioning Halala, but and Rashi says the word Halala here in the Rashi and top of the Amid, but there is a discussion in the Rishonim if she'll become Asr eventually because she's a Halala, or will she become Asr because she's a Zaina. But let's go on. And the reverse, Loi. And v'chi teima hachi nami yesh lo lahachal b'bas gedim. And if you're going to answer no, that this Tzodaka Kohen will have the right to give another woman the permission to eat truma, that will be if he gets engaged to a bas gedim, as we'll explain in a moment. In other words, he as a Kohen might not be allowed to marry a Giyotis herself, but a bas gedim. That means if there's a union between a ger and a bas Yisrael, and they produce a daughter, so her father is a ger, her mother is a Yisraelis. So according to certain Tanoim, a Kohen is allowed to marry her. And if he will marry her, then she will be allowed to eat if she's not called a Kahal Hashem, if the union is kosher. So the Gemara says that's not so simple. Who told you that in such a case that marriage is kosher? There's a question whether a Kohen, Tzodaka, is allowed to marry a Bas Gedim. Rabbi Yechanan himself asked it from Rabbi Oishia, if such a union is permissible. And Rabbi Oishia did not answer. And we'll see soon he did not answer because he did not know the answer. So if the only case where the Kal V'chomer was refuted, the Kal V'chomer of Rameir was refuted by Rab Shimon and Rabbi Elazar, is from the Kohen marrying a Bas Gedim, this Tzodaka, Lav Dafka, Rabbi Oishia will agree to that. So the question is on Rabbi Oishia, how did he compare the case to the Mishnah to the Kohen Tzodaka that marries a woman, whether she could or could not eat truma before they have the bia psula?
The Kal V'chomer would not work if you say that the Tzodaka cannot eat a marriage.
No, fakir. The response to Rav Meir Kal V'chomer, the response to Rav Meir Kal V'chomer is Rab Shimon and Rabbi Elazar could give that response if she could, if she will be allowed to eat it. So then he will be Michael in another scenario.
Right, so that is the same as the previous case with the kind of the Grusha, because he could be Mater some other.
That's right. But the concept. But here, since that Rabbi Oishia, who's the Baal HaMemra himself, did not know if he can be Michael b'Makam Acher or not, so it's a question on his comparison to the case of the Mishnah. Now, Itmer Abaya Amar. Abaya now will farem for Rabbi Oishia, and to find a case where this Kohen Tzodaka will be allowed to be Michael b'Makam Acher, not in a case of Bas Gedim, because that case is a question mark case. So one case will be according to Abaya, Hoyel u'machila b'lo yidda'a. Very simple case. What happens if a Kohen who is not yet a Kirush Shavcha, who is not yet a Tzodaka, and this is a sugi that will be very important. I know we mentioned this in the beginning of the Masechta, if you remember, that there's a difference between someone who was born with these illnesses versus someone who became ill later. We'll get to that later, not that far later. But right now, let's learn like this. If a Kohen was born healthy, and he married a Bas Yisrael, she can eat Truma, she's eating Truma. During the marriage, she became this Tzodaka. What has to happen now? He doesn't have to divorce her per se. He has to divorce her, but what is the Isser? The Isser is they're not allowed to have an act of cohabitation together. They can't be Bia together. But until he has Bia with her, she's still allowed to eat Truma. Why is she allowed to eat Truma? Because she's married to a Kohen. So this is called a scenario where the Kohen is being Michael, someone else. If they are going to have a Bia, she becomes a Halala or a Zaina. Being that they're not allowed to be together, he has to divorce her. When he will divorce her, right? If she has no children, she's a Bas Yisrael, she can no longer eat Seder. But there is a moment where this Kohen Tzodaka could be Michael, someone else. Which is why Rab Shimon and Rabbi Elazar will say that here also, they're engaged, she should be allowed to eat. This answers the Rabbi Oishia. Rabbi gives another scenario, Hoyel u'machila ba'avoda v'shevchosef ha'knanim. He gives a gavaldik answer. His answer is that the Kohen's power of allowing someone other than him to eat Truma doesn't only go to a wife. It goes to children, and it goes to his possessions. A Kohen Tzodaka can own slaves. And when he owns them, they could eat Truma. So he is someone who's Michael to someone else. Now the only question is, why didn't Abaye give Rava's answer? Why didn't Rava give Abaye's answer? And the Gemara is going to show how each one is deficient. Abaye did not say like Rava, who spoke about his machilo bavadov, right, v'shivchaisav haknanim, because kinyan the issues, mikinyan the issues yalfinon. Right? What is the question? What is the case of Rabbi Ishia? A kohen psuadaka that got engaged to a Bas Yisrael. They're not allowed to be together. So if you want to show that he has the right to give his kala the power to eat truma, you have to bring it from a case where he can give another sort of wife, which is the answer that Abaye gave, right, when they are married, and later he became the psuadaka. But lo yalfinan kinyan the issues mekinyan davadim. The fact, the type of him bequeathing truma to his avodim is not like it's done to a wife. And Rava did not say like Abaye, that Shani Hassam, you can't prove from the case where a kohen who was healthy, who married a Bas Yisrael, and during the marriage he becomes a psuadaka. Over there, you know why the wife can still eat if he did not yet have a relation with her, shekfar achala, because she was already eating. She was already eating. Here, he got engaged to her when he's already a psuadaka. The whole engagement was an act that's an isur. So it's not the same. And Abaye is going to respond to that. That shekfar achala loy amrinan, the fact that one was already eating is completely irrelevant when it comes to a kohen bequeathing the right to eat truma. And the proof is, because the ilay teimahachi, we had this before, if shekfar achala is a logic, any Bas Yisrael that's married to a kohen, and let's say her husband dies, and they do not have children. The moment the husband dies, the widow can no longer eat truma. But why don't we say, Teichol, let her continue to eat, because she was eating until now, shekfar achala. So shekfar achala means nothing. And therefore, he was right in bringing the case that this psuadaka could be Michael, the wife, when he became a psuadaka, in the marriage, and they were not together afterwards, since when he became a psuadak. The Rava responds that Hassam, when the husband dies, paka kinyane, his connection with her is gone. Hacha over here, when they're still married, loy paka kinyane. So here, we can use the logic of shekfar achala. Anyways, we have both Abaye and Rava. They respond and they substantiate the din of Rabbi Oishia, and they compare it to the Mishnah, because here this is also a case where the husband could be Michael to someone else. Now let's go to this question. Gufa, we learned before that Rabbi Yochanan asked Rabbi Oishia, a tzua daka kohen. The kohen is someone who's not allowed to marry any woman that's called Kahal Hashem, because he has maimed, again, or crushed testicles. Shenasa bas geidim, he married the daughter of a ger. We're speaking about a convert man who married a Bas Yisrael, who produced a daughter, and he got engaged to her, or he married her. If the marriage is a kosher marriage, then she can eat truma. Is the marriage a kosher marriage? Now there are two reasons.
Can be a convert woman?
Someone explain to you. There's two reasons why this will or will not be, on his side and on her side. First of all, a kohen psuadaka, as we'll see in a moment, there's a question whether he's still called a kohen or not. Maybe because of the fact that he's blemished, he's not as holy as a kohen anymore. Maybe if he loses kedushas kohen, maybe he loses the power to allow his wife to eat truma.
What about him?
We'll get to that in a moment. Mitzat Sheini, we're speaking about the concept of converts. Are converts called Kahal Hashem? Halachically or not? And if they are not, are their children called? And as we'll see soon, there's a three-way machlekes tanoim regarding the children of Gedim, if they're considered Kahal Hashem or not. And let's talk it through. So Rabbi Yochanan asked that from Rabbi Oishia, and Ishtek and Rabbi Oishia did not respond. Okay. He didn't respond. Now, I want you to know a good rule. When a person is learning one subject, you're not allowed to ask him a question from another subject. Because the one, he's not in it. Certain people are exceptions to that. Certain people have the whole Torah in front of them clear, and no matter what they're learning at the moment, you can ask them any question that you want. So it was common that when someone like Rabbi Yochanan, who was a great sage, went over to Rabbi Oishia, and he asked him a question and he did not respond, his non-responding was because, I'm not learning this right now, don't ask me these questions right now. However, during that moment, another great man came in. We'll see the other great man was Rish Lakish. And he asked from Rabbi Oishia another question, and he responded. That question was from a whole different subject. So what did Rabbi Yechanan realize? That Rabbi Oishia is responding any type of question. And who was that other great person? Rish Lakish. So when that happened, Amalei Rabbi Yehuda Nisiyah Rabbi Oishia. So now Rabbi Yehuda Nisiyah asked Rabbi Oishia, Atu Rabbi Yechanan lav gavra Rabbahu. What? To Rish Lakish's questions you answer. To Rabbi Yechanan you don't? Is Rabbi Yechanan not a great man? And you can't say that you didn't respond to him because he asked you from a topic that you're not learning in right now. Rish Lakish also asked you from a different topic. Omar Leis Rabbi Oishia tells Rabbi Yehuda Nisiyah, I didn't answer because I didn't know. He says the Kabayim in Milsa the Leslie Psara. He asked me a question that I'm not certain. And as the Gemara is going to work out exactly what the doubt is. There's a very important Tosfos here. The Tosfos is the third Tosfos in the Yom Asa Gavra Rabba Chrita. It's important just historically. The more we'll learn together, the more we're going to figure out who lived in whose generation. We know that Rabbi Yechanan and Rish Lakish, they were from the earliest era of the Amoraim. Almost the beginning of the temple of the times of the Amoraim. There's a story in Bava Metzia regarding Rish Lakish. Most people think that Rish Lakish is a Baal Tshuva. Right, that Rabbi Yechanan was bathing and Rish Lakish was the head of the bandits and he saw Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Yechanan convinced him to do tshuva and then he became a great man in learning. The Rabbeinu Tam says that Rish Lakish wasn't a Baal Tshuva, he was a Chayzer b'tshuva. He grew up in a religious home and he was learned as a child. Later he went off the way and Rabbi Yechanan only brought him back. I'm not saying the word only to minimize it, perhaps a Chayzer b'tshuva is a lot harder. But just we don't have the wrong picture that it's not that he knew nothing and Rabbi Yechanan brought him to Torah the first time. He brought him back to Torah. And they prove it from this story. Rabbi Oishia was very old. When Rabbi Yechanan and Rish Lakish re-met later, Rabbi Oishia was no longer living. So for this story to happen, and we're calling Rish Lakish already a Gavra Rabba, it must have been in the youth of Rish Lakish, when Rabbi Oishia was still living. Interesting. So it's good to know that. So Rabbi Rish Lakish was already an observant, learned Jew who later went off the way. He became a bandit, and then Rabbi Yechanan later brought him back. And now the Gemara is going to speak out the question to get it from all sides. Laman, Laman, according to whom did Rabbi Oishia not know? Ila Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds like this. These are the three-way machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda holds that if the father is a ger, even if the mother is a Jewish woman, such a child cannot marry a kohen. A kohen cannot marry a geyoris. A kohen cannot marry a daughter of a ger. Judaism goes through the mother, but yichus, we've learned about this many times, goes by the father. So if her father was a ger, she's still considered a geyoris or a bas gerim, and no kohen can marry her. It's a prohibited marriage. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov holds that if either parent is Jewish, a kohen can marry the child. Rabbi Yossi holds,
if either parent is not a ger.
If either parent is Jewish, correct, then she's fit. Rabbi Yossi holds that if either of the parents, that even if both parents are Gedim, a kohen can marry the descendants. The descendants of Gedim are not called Gedim anymore. A Geyoris is someone who the kohen cannot marry to, but the descendants of Gedim he could, even if both parents are Gedim. So now let's go like this. If we're gonna say that the question was asked according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, another important thing that Rabbi Yehuda considers Gedim themselves Kahal Hashem. Imagine. They're called Kahal Hashem. So like this. Whether, what's the doubt? The doubt here is, since the kohen is a blemished kohen, the question is, can someone marry to him, eat truma? And like Danny asked before, what about him himself? It's clear from this Gemara that even if he loses some kedusha and he cannot bequeath it to his wife, a kohen balmum could eat truma. There's no question about that. The question is, can someone marry to him, eat truma? So I guess, if he's a kohen, if he stays a full kohen, that could bequeath the power to a kosher wife to eat, bein lav b'ketushas koi, whether Rabbi Yehuda holds that he doesn't have any more the power to bequeath his wife because he's blemished, loy achala, the wife will for sure not be allowed to eat. Why not? And the Gemara talks it out. If he's considered a kohen, loy achala, if he's considered a kohen, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that bas ger, like we mentioned, if the father is a ger, bas ger zachar is like a bas cholol zachar, and a kohen is not allowed to marry her. And if he's holy like a kohen, so the marriage with her is a non-kosher marriage. The bia is going to be a bia asura. So that's on this side. And ilav b'ketushas kohen, even if he is no longer doesn't have the right to bequeath to his wife the right to eat because he loses his kedusha as a kohen because he's blemished, is again lo yachala. The ha'amrinin kahal geirim mikra kol. According to Rabbi Yehuda, they're considered a kahal. So forget about him being a kohen. A petzua daka cannot marry kal Hashem, even if he's a not kohen. So even if he's not a kohen, so the marriage is not prohibited because he's a kohen, but the marriage is prohibited because he's a petzua daka, and she is considered kal Hashem. So either way you look at it, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the marriage is prohibited. And if we're going to go according to the opinion that Rabbi Yosi that holds, look at this, that Gedim are not called Kal Hashem, even the descendants of Gedim, again, Bein b'ketushas koi, whether he's still considered a kohen. When it comes to marriage, not bequeathing the rights, when it comes to marriage, there are certain women who a kohen cannot marry. The question is a petzua daka still considered holy like a kohen? Can a petzua daka marry a gerusha, for example? That's the question, if he's holy or not holy. Bein b'ketushas koi, whether he's still considered a kohen who's restricted in marriage with whom he can marry, bein lav b'ketushas koi, or if he's not anymore considered holy kohen and he has no restrictions in marrying women because of his kohuna, mimanav shach achala, this woman could eat truma. Why? B'ketushas koi, if he's considered holy, so let's say he's considered a kohen, but the marriage is a kosher marriage. Why? She can eat because the Amar Rabbi Yosi holds af ger shenasa giyotis, that even a ger marries a giyotis bitoy ksheda lekahuna. Rabbi Yosi,
not just for Psudaka?
yeah. In other words, Rabbi Yosi is the leaning opinion that holds that even if both parents are converts, the only person with whom a kohen cannot marry is the giyotis herself. But their descendants, even if the giyotis married a ger, a kohen can marry them. So it's a kosher marriage.
So, is it Kal Hashem or is it not Kal Hashem?
No, Rabbi Yossi, that's the whole beauty. Rabbi Yossi does not call them Kal Hashem, so it's perfect.
Kal Hashem.
But he can marry them. It's ironic. It's minakotz alakotz.
Marry any kohen.
Yes.
Including a Psudaka.
Yes. It makes sense. Good. Ilav, it's just ironic. Ilav, and if, because he's a P'tzua Daka, there's no more restrictions on marriage because of his kohuna, then again she can eat. Because the ha'amar kahal gedim lo yikra kol. If kahal gedim lo yikra kol, then he's allowed to marry into her. In other words, according to Rabbi Yosi, the marriage is not a prohibited marriage. Whether the P'tzua Daka is restricted as a kohen or whether he's not restricted as a kohen because of him being blemished. Eloma, where did Rabbi Yosi have the doubt? Ali b'da haytanam. That was according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the Kavanaki opinion. The Tanan Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Isha bas gedim lo isinasi lekuhuna achetehei imoy mi Yisrael. You know, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds that one of the parents have to be Jewish, and even if the mother is Jewish, then a kohen can marry her for sure if the father is Jewish, because Yichus goes after the father. And now, what's the question? That kashrus that when Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds that if one of her parents is Jewish, she's fit to marry a kohen. Question is she considered Kal Hashem or not? Is she kosher to marry a kohen? And here, but she's not called Kal Hashem. And therefore over here, even though he's a P'tzua Daka, he's allowed to marry her. and therefore she can eat. Or Dilma, that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds that she's like any other Jewish woman, because one of her parents were Jewish. Not only could she marry a Kohen, but she's already called Kahal Hashem. Now, if she's called Kahal Hashem, then a P'tzua Daka cannot marry. Forget about the fact that he's a Kohen. It's a prohibited marriage because he's a P'tzua Daka. And therefore, that was the question that Rabbi Yeshua did not know the answer to Rabbi Yechanan. Period. And now the Gemara says, we will give the answer to that. Tashima. All right, Danny, have it clear? In other words, a P'tzua Daka could eat Truma. There's no question about that. Speaking about Kedushasei means, being that he's blemished, maybe he becomes not such a Kohen anymore. And therefore he's, let's say, can he marry a Gerusha? That was the question. Can he marry a Gerusha? Kohen cannot marry a Gerusha. Maybe P'tzua Daka could. Now there's another problem. He cannot marry into Kahal Hashem. So that's the issue over here. Is she considered Kahal Hashem or not? And according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, that was the doubt. He didn't know. And if she's considered Kahal Hashem, he cannot marry her. Not because he's a Kohen. Even if he's not a Kohen.
So who can a blemish go and marry?
We're talking about this specific blemish.
Right.
This specific blemish. One second. This specific blemish is not a Kohanic prohibition. Someone whose private parts are maimed in a certain way, on certain conditions, can marry a convert, for example. The problem with a Kohen cannot marry a convert. There are other people that are not called Kahal Hashem. The question is, the moment you're a Kohen also, it gets complicated. So the best complicated case will be this case, where you're marrying the daughter of the father Ger, mother Jewish. Question mark whether she's called Kahal Hashem or not. And therefore the doubt is, if she's not called Kahal Hashem, no, it's if she's not called Kahal Hashem, he can marry her. Okay. Tashema, and everyone agrees that Truma he can eat. Mamash, amazing. Amazing, huh? Let's go right. So Tashema, ki yasi Rav Acha bar Rab Chanina, midraima, when Rab Acha bar Chanina came from the south, he came and he brought a braisa that was unknown to us, and the braisa reads the following: Minayin lep'tzua daka kohen. From where do we know that this case that a kohen was a p'tzua daka? Shenasa bas gerim, that married the daughter of a ger. Father Ger, mother Jewish. Shema'achila betruma, that she could eat truma. The marriage is a kosher marriage, and therefore, even though he's blemished, truma he can eat. Truma he could bequeath to his wife. Remember, because it says v'koyin ki yikna nefesh kinyan kaspai. This pasuk is actually speaking about the power that the kohen has to give truma to people who he owns. But the word nefesh, the way the Rishonim explain, are extra. And nefesh, this extra word, comes to engage this marriage. Yoichal boy. That was the braisa. And now the Gemara is going to point out that this braisa is the braisa of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Because Laman, who is the author of this braisa? And mamish, like we learned before, if the author of the braisa is Rabbi Yehuda ha'amar, whether he's considered a kohen, bein lav b'k'toshasei kohen, or he's no longer considered a kohen, mimanavshech loy achala, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that they are called Kahal Hashem. And since they're called Kahal Hashem, lo yovi p'tzua daka b'Kahal Hashem. Ila Rabbi Yosi, we said mimanavshech, she could eat. Why do we need the pasuk? Because ha'amar bein b'k'toshasei kohen, bein lav b'k'toshasei kohen, achala, she could eat. Elalav, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and Vishma Mina, that kashrus itois v'ba. That now that she is already born Jewish, she's upgraded as being someone who is kosher to marry a kohen, but she's not yet called Kahal Hashem, and therefore it's a kosher marriage. And va'achala shma mina, and all of this just substantiates Rabbi Oisha's statement. So Rabbi Oisha was good in comparing this case to the case of our Mishnah, because there is a case where a kohen p'tzua daka can be Michael his wife. The question only was if he married a normal Bas Yisrael. And according to the Mishnah Rishoina, and a year passed and they're not yet married, can she eat it already? So that's what Rabbi Oisha said. That's the machlekes in our Mishnah between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. Itmer, moving on. We're going to learn about another case where a kohen married an unfit woman. This is a very interesting case in the Gemara, and we're going to speak a little bit about chuppah. Itmar, we learned, Rav Omar, turning the page, we have now a very short amud. Yesh chuppah l'psulais. The way Rashi explains the case will be the following. Let's speak, for example, about a kohen gadol who is going to violate the lav and is going to marry an almana. But we're speaking about the Kohen Gadol, look at this, who did not give her Kedushin. He went straight to Chuppah. Now, Mazeh Chuppah. There is Kedushin and there's Nesuyin. Kedushin is money, shtar, midoiraisa, bia. And Nesuyin is then living together as husband and wife. Before a person does Nesuyin, the person is going to take his kala under a chuppah. We paskin, that Ramah paskins, that a chuppah means a canopy. There are other opinions brought down in the Ramah that a chuppah means them eating together in his room. And I'm emphasizing the word his, like most people who are Masadar Kedusha know, that the Cheder Yichud, that we, especially Ashkenazim, take our kalas into right after the chuppah, has to be his. Whether you make a kinyan, which is ideal for it, or whether the Tzfardim don't do yichud here right after the chuppah. They need to have yichud, but they don't do it right after the chuppah. But in any event, they have to eat together in his environment. There's also opinions that is not common practice that hold that chuppah means that the chassan and kala have to be under, let's say, a talis to the exclusion of anyone else. So you see today many Sephardic chuppahs that aside of the larger chuppah canopy under which the Rav is standing and the family members are standing, you have a talis that you put only over the heads of the chassan and kala. But whatever, we try to do the chuppahs l'kol alma. But whatever chuppah is, look at the case over here. Kedushin was not made. He made straight chuppah, which means he's about to be with her. Because right after chuppah, they move in together. The question is, yesh chuppah lapsulais. Shmuel says, ein chuppah lapsulais. And as we'll explain in a moment, as it becomes clear, that Rav's opinion, yesh chuppah lapsulais, is even according to Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah, who said that whenever a woman is waiting l'biyah hasura, she cannot eat truma, but if she's engaged. Over here, they're not even engaged. On the other hand, he took her under the chuppah. So he will hold that she will be allowed to eat truma. Imagine. Even according to Rabbi Meir. Shmuel, who says, ein chuppah lapsulais, will hold even according to Rabbi Oishia and Abshimon and our Mishnah that hold.
Just to clarify, once they did sleep together, then she would no longer.
Absolutely. Once they're together, then she can no longer have truma. But here, Shmuel will learn that even according to the Rabbi Lazar and Abshimon, that hold that being that they're engaged, right, according to the Mishnah Rishayna, after a year, or whatever the case is, she is allowed to eat truma. That is, he holds, that's because they're engaged. Here they're not engaged. So the chuppah does not give her the right to eat truma. Ein chuppah lapsulais. Amar Shmuel says, Shmuel, moidali Abba. Abba was either the name of Rav, and being that Shmuel was Rav's contemporary, so he called him by his name, or the way Rashi says over here, that Abba was the name of Chashivus. Abba is like Rabbi, Rav, and Fakir, Shmuel, who was a contemporary, had tremendous respect to Rav. He never called him by his name, he called him Abba. He says, Umaydali Abba, but Abba agreed to me that if she is not yet 3 years old, B'tinoikes P'chusa Mibas Shal Lishanam V'yemechad, Hoyel Ve'ein Labiyah, being that even if they would be physically together, it's not called an act of cohabitation, ein la chuppah, and therefore the chuppah means nothing. And of course, she will not be allowed to eat truma. Not there was kedushin. Chuppah doesn't mean anything. The bia doesn't mean anything. She can't eat truma. And Amar Rava says, Afano namitanina. We learn in the Braisa clearly that a girl who's under 3 years old, if someone is with her, that's not called a halachic act of bia. What did we learn in the Braisa? If a woman is 3 years and 1 day, miskadeshes bebia, as we mentioned before, that midoiraisa, one of the 3 ways to effect an engagement, an erusin, is through bia. So if someone had bia with a bas shalosh shanim, she's mikudeshes. Another din v'im ba aleha yavam. Imagine, she was already widowed from her first husband, and now there's a mitzvah of yibum, and the yavam does yibum with her, which is an act of bia, kidna'a, that consummates their marriage. Another din that the chayavim aleha mishum esesh ish. If she was already married, make it clear that for a minor, meaning a girl under 12 to get married, midairaisa, it only happens if her father married her off. But her father married her off. So she's halachically, biblically a married woman. If another man has bia with her, then chenek, she will be exempt because she's a ktana. But the man had a relation with an eishes ish. Or another din, umitama es bayala letame mishkev tachtin ke'elyon. We just learned recently that when a woman is a nida, the man who has a relation with her, God forbid, becomes tamei like her. What does it mean he becomes tamei like her? That he becomes a av hatuma. Nevertheless, you should just know that there's a difference between the nida and the man who has a relation with her. A nida is a woman who has the level of av, and there's a special tuma there that if she lays down on a mattress, let's say there are 10 mattresses, then the lowest mattress becomes tummy like her. It's called tumas mishkav u'maishav, that if she sits on something that was meant for her to sit on, if she lays on something that is meant for that to be laid upon, it becomes tummy like her. If the man who had a relation with Anida, he becomes an Av. But if he lays down on a mattress, the mattress becomes a Rishon. In other words, that's the words over here, that umetame es boyala, that she makes the man who had a relation with her tame like an Av, but not mamish like her. That latame mishkav hatachton, that it makes the mattress that he touches ke'elyon, like the clothing that is worn by a zav. If a zav touches clothing, the clothing becomes a rishon, so the mattress becomes a rishon. Now, if a man just touches a nida, what's the din? The nida is an av. What is the man? What is the person? Just a rishon. What does he need to do? Only go to the mikvah and wait until the night. A man who has a relation with a nida has to count 7 clean days. It's a whole different thing. So that is only if she, a nida, was 3 years and 1 day or older. Another din, nisais l'kayin, if she marries a kayin, being that she's 3 years and a day, so her bia consummates the marriage, she can eat truma. Or the reverse, if someone with whom she cannot have a relation has a relation with her, then she becomes a woman who can no longer marry a kain. Psala. She becomes a zaina. In other words, end of Braisa. So infers the Gemara, being that the relation is a relation, if someone has a relation with her, she will no longer be allowed to be with a kain, then mi pasla b'chuppah. According to Rav. However, since the act of bia is not considered a bia, and that's the way we stand.
I understand this under 3-year-old that marries a kain, would she be able to eat truma at all? If she can't have bia, then is it even a marriage? I mean, what's...
Okay, that's a very good question. And the answer would be like this, that Mida Eiraisa, being that she's engaged to a kain, she would be allowed to eat, if not for Rav Meir's din, which holds that what? That hoyel umishtameres lebia psula. She's mishtameres lebia psula, because when she will become 3 years old and she'll continue in this puzzle of marriage, correct? Right. So according to Rav Meir, she will not be allowed to eat truma. According to Rav Lazar and Rav Shimon, if she's not 3 years old yet, independent. According to Rav Lazar and Rav Shimon, until she has the biyasura, she can eat truma. Now, comes along Amar Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama says that I want you to know that if there was a chuppah done without kedushin to this psula, we're speaking about over 3 years old, just a chuppah, that is just like the machlokes of Rav Meir and Rav Shimon. Le Rav Meir daf nun ches to Amar kedushin paslei, because she's mishtameres l'bi psula, chuppah nami psula. The fact that she's engaged, not engaged, the fact she went under the chuppah is also a woman that's mishtameres l'bi psula, she cannot eat truma. Le Rav Lazar and Rav Shimon the Amar kedushin loy psali, that until the actual violation happened, she can eat truma, chuppah nami no psala. So here we have a third opinion, and this third opinion is going to be refuted. Let's just read the last few words. The Gemara says, "Mimai." How can Rami Bar Chama say it? You cannot compare the case of chuppah to the case of kedushin. Dilma at kan lekamad av meir hasam ela kedushin. Since by kedushin there's a kinyan, so they are connected. The next act after kedushin, halachic act, is nisuyin. So she's mishtameres will be a psula. Avol chuppah, just because they went under the chuppah, like kanila. Inami reverse at kan lekamad Rab Lazar ben Rab Shimon hasam ela kedushin the like krivi lebia. Why did Rab Lazar ben Rab Shimon say that after kedushin she could eat truma? Because between kedushin and nisuyin there's a year time. Between kedushin and nisuyin you still need to have a chuppah. Something else needs to happen. Avol chuppah, but if he went and he did the chuppah, so he shouldn't have done it. He should have done kedushin. But we know that now that he did chuppah, he's about to have bia with her. The kreva lebia, maybe they too will say the psala. And we'll continue our Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow after we refuted Rami Bar Chama.